Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is Seeking Sustainability Live, number 174 today. We're talking about Safecast with Azby Brown. Thank you so much for joining, Azby.
Thank you for having me.
I said before we started that actually once I started researching you, I thought, oh no, we've got too much to talk about. You have written some very interesting books and done some great research on the Edo period and sustainability. So we'll have to get you back another time to talk about that.
Yeah, totally happy to do that anytime.
Wonderful. So today we're focusing on Safecast. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction about what that is?
Yes, Safecast is an open source, crowdsourced project to collect radiation and other environmental data that began really immediately after the disaster in March 2011. And the reason it was started was because of the lack of information and the lack of, let's say, trustworthy information from government and other sources in the weeks and months following that disaster. And initially, we hoped to just aggregate data from different places and put it on a map that people could see, and then realized there wasn't enough data. So then the project focused on developing new hardware. Again, all open source, innovative hardware that would allow people to take mobile measurements while driving around with their car. So we developed what we call the B-Geigy. And this is an example of a B-Geigy Nano, which is sold as a kit, designed as a kit, and it has GPS and data logging, and you just turn it on and drive around or walk around, and it makes data that you can then upload to the Safecast database online, and then it's visualized on our map. And we currently have data from over 100 countries around the world, over 160 million data points. And it is the largest open data set of radiation anywhere, and probably the largest set of radiation data anywhere, even if it's not open. In other words, governments often don't have this much data. So this is what Safecast is about. And after we had this great success with the radiation project, we moved into air quality monitoring and are looking at what other aspects of environmental monitoring would lend themselves to this crowdsourced open source approach.
To talk about the founders a little bit, why was it created? It was started by three people, right? Can you give us
Yes, yes.
that story?
Yeah, basically, initial founders were Joey Ito. At the time, he was director of MIT Media Lab. Peter Franken, who was a Tokyo-based, actually fintech expert, also an engineer, and Sean Bonner, who was at the time LA-based. He has a background in music, had a record label, and also had a lot of experience with startups. So they had known each other from before, and they sort of started a chat immediately, after the disaster began, and pulled people in to brainstorm how things could happen. And this process, this sort of networking of people, really got a lot of very talented people engaged, such as Ray Ozzie, who was the former CTO of Microsoft and then took over Microsoft after Bill Gates stepped down. And he's a brilliant engineer and is still doing a lot of engineering for a lot of our projects. And really wonderful people came in and lent their expertise.
And could you talk a little bit about your role? It seems like you've done a lot of talks around the world introducing the kind of work that Safecast does. Is that right?
Yes, it's interesting because I didn't really have a background in this area in data per se. I mean, I studied programming, in high school and university, and was always interested in things like computer graphics because my background is actually design. So I studied architecture and fine art. I was an architecture professor at the Kanazawa Institute of Technology for 20 years, and of course worked with technology, instituted their CAD design program there. And now I'm at the sculpture department of Musashino Art University, Musabi, and also established their digital fabrication lab there. So I have some background in technical things, but I was not really a data person, and I'm not a programmer. But what I found and what drew me into the project was was, like a lot of people, I was learning about radiation and joining discussions online in various places, Facebook groups, other, mailing lists, etc., and then discussing what we were seeing and what the implications were, and trying to teach each other and help each other understand where to find good information and what do we need to know and how do we know it. So that brought me into the Safecast discussions, and I would just write these sort of detailed point-by-point analyses of statements or data, or looking at food measurement data, for instance, or looking at radiation fallout data and saying, well, this implies this doesn't imply this, and always giving citations, because where does the data come from and how do we know it? Because I'm an academic. I mean, I'm trained as an academic, so that's what I did, and I ended up writing a lot. And I became the lead researcher and writing a lot of blog posts, and then, yes, doing talks, writing what we call the Safecast report, which, has been online, PDF. We also have made a printed version of that. And little by little, my role has been engaging with both the public, the general public, let's say as an educator, and also with the expert community. So I've gone to lots of, I've been at the IAEA many times, have been invited along with other colleagues to train experts in network data gathering and analysis, or also to train people in communication, or to take part in policy discussions, specifically in Europe for the European community, to get the actual policy to include citizen-based data gathering, et cetera. So it's been an interesting life, meeting with a lot of experts, et cetera, and finding a lot of interest. And yet we can still talk about, well, how much further do we need to go to really have this accepted and implemented as a matter of course?
That's wonderful. And of course, the communication aspect and relations with the community and explaining the data is such a key part of what the model of Safecast seems to be. Let's talk about some of the key points a little bit, starting with Safecast is voluntary.
Basically, yes, it's a volunteer-based organization, and there would be some people that maybe need to get paid to keep the servers running or things like that. But basically, it is about gathering a community of people who are doing this of their own accord, who want to gather data and put it in the public domain, and our system allows them to do that. So everything that people upload is open source, and people communicate for a lot of different ways. I mean, they participate for a lot of different reasons. Some of our volunteers, are very concerned about what's happening in their area. For instance, in Fukushima or other parts of Japan, we have a very large and active volunteer base in Fukushima. Other parts of the world, maybe we have people because they're interested in the educational aspect. People who like to build things like, solder together electronic things like the Bigaigi. Maybe we have people who are very anti-nuclear and looking for, information that will support their cause. Or we get people who are on the other side. And Safecast doesn't take a stance of pro or anti-nuclear. We say that we are pro-data. But what we really find is that, the human side is the more challenging side. Getting people together, keeping them informed, motivated, it really is more difficult than developing hardware. And although I think we found the secret sauce, and even this past year under coronavirus, where we were not able to do the typical events and workshops that we had been doing for many years, we still had lots of activity, lots of data coming in, independently from all around the world.
I'm showing now from your website about how Safecast is pro-data, Safecast is apolitical, and I found that really interesting when I was listening to, I think it was Peter, talking about how it's a kind of a multidisciplinary group that you're bringing in. You're bringing in artists and designers, researchers, IT experts, and that's kind of the beauty of it, because you never know how the data needs to be translated to reach certain audiences. And I thought that was really powerful. Really good point.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, so much of the success that we've had and what we've been able to accomplish has to be credited to the people who decided to get involved. And many of them, and again, I'll include myself, wear a lot of hats. We're very comfortable. We do have a lot of people who are artists, even dancers, musicians, etc., who are involved and doing maybe something else for Safecast. But, we sort of take what we call an anti-disciplinary approach. In other words, one of the issues with the world in general, and you may encounter this in the other things that you're investigating and working on regarding sustainability, is that we are too specialized. We believe that if you become trained in one area, you don't necessarily need to master other areas or be familiar. Whereas the mark of a developed person, we think, this is personal philosophy, is that you are engaged in many things and you have developed many competencies. And we're lucky that those are the kinds of people who were attracted to Safecast from the beginning. And for me personally, it's been a great bunch of people to hang out with. Really interesting, we'll be talking about, movies or music or going out to eat or whatever, even as we're talking about the data and the hardware and everything else we're doing. So it really, it takes lots of different kinds of talents and skill sets to pull something like this off. And we've been very fortunate that those kinds of people have been attracted to our project.
I think as a teacher, you know this from your years of teaching in the classroom, that there's certain students who need visuals in order to take in information. And I'm showing this screenshot from Peter's talk where he's talking about antidisciplinary. And this is artist's rendition of what data looks like as he's driving through Fukushima, and used with music and art. And Peter was saying, I never would have envisioned this, but an artist interpretation can maybe communicate this message to a whole new group of people who would not listen to any other kind of communication about the data, right?
Yeah, and it's been great. Again, people have done things with the data that we never expected. And often independently. So that the other thing about our system and our data is because it's open, nobody has to ask us for permission to use it or anything. And if they have questions, they say, hey, I want to do this. Can you help me? We're happy to help. But often things like this particular artist project, it was a Hong Kong artist, I believe, just came out of the blue. It's like, wow, look what somebody did. And it's true. People have their own, ways to understand things. And often a visceral, visual approach is going to be more effective, with all the caveats of, what are you trying to communicate? Are you trying to communicate some tiny difference that is significant because of people living in a particular area or what's happening to their food there? Or are you just trying to show an overall sense of impact and extent? And these require sort of different approaches to visualization, and artists have a lot to offer. And we've always welcomed artistic projects. And, there have been people who've generated music with it, who've done, embroidery with it. We've been included in many art exhibitions or design exhibitions as well, because this kind of data and information communication lends itself to that.
And one of the key points that I've seen a few of you raise as well is, of course, data access is useless without understanding.
Absolutely. And as we engage with, again, communication experts, risk communication experts, emergency communication experts, which, we become very much a part of that community. It's always the question, how do we help people understand this stuff? And often one of the failings of the official approach until now has been this sort of top-down, in the worst cases, patronizing approach. Well, we just will explain the numbers and tell people not to worry. And I would say the consensus has grown broadly within the expert communication community that this is not the right way, that people understand things differently, and you have to really give them visualizations and give them good analogies and give them other bases for understanding. And it's a long slog, though. You still see people at meetings and conferences saying, oh, if only the people understood the numbers, they wouldn't be so worried, which is just the wrong-headed approach. But there is a gradual shift in been the consensus that we're seeing. And often people cite Safecast as an example and really want to learn from how we have made it possible for a lot of people to understand this stuff pretty quickly and immediately. And then to provide ways, more information for them to learn more about the details and more about the fine points of the issues that they're thinking about. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing, and everyone has different ways of understanding, and we need to engage people. The thing I need to really stress, though, is participation is the key. Finding ways to let people do it with their own hands, do it themselves, is the key to getting real understanding and then real, interest, and then basically to answer their questions. And in some cases, some people will make a big Geigy and they will, measure, let's say even in Fukushima, they'll measure and they'll say, well, it's not as bad as I thought. Or they'll say, wow, this is pretty bad, but at least I know what I'm dealing with, and the responses can be very, very wide. This is vastly preferable to having to look at a table of data from the government and say, well, they're telling me it's okay, but how do I know that that's true? So we're providing people with a reality check that they can do themselves. And this is the key.
It's so important. Joe Moras has joined us from YouTube. Thanks, Joe. He says, unanticipated uses of the data is one of the great benefits of being open.
Great. That's Joe Moras, who is really one of our lead engineers on the project and a great colleague. And we talk about this stuff all the time and unanticipated uses. So a lot of, you were talking about the artists using it, for instance, but we've seen spin-offs and people sort of taking what we've done and applying a lot of the lessons of environmental mapping, for instance, or open source hardware to other contexts. And that's been very, very interesting. So yes, it's hopefully something like Safecast will lead to lots of spin-offs in other directions.
Yeah. I was really interested listening to your talk about how there wasn't exactly a lack of data after Fukushima, but the way it was presented and the interpretations people were making were sometimes it was convoluted. So one of the things you guys tried to do is create good design of data, which would more easily communicate what the data meant. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Just to step back a moment, there was a lack of data at the beginning, certainly the first weeks, certainly the first couple of months. And if you look at maps, et cetera, that the government released, it took, a couple of months to get a good map out to 80 kilometers from Fukushima Daiichi based on aerial surveys, for instance. It wasn't until September or October that the first official maps showing the fallout in the Tokyo area were released. Now, this is unconscionable. I mean, how could it take so long? So there was actually a lack. And then there was, as I mentioned, this sort of patronizing attitude. They'll throw a number at you and say, well, this is a standard, blah, 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 so this means it's okay. And there was no real basis for really understanding that. When Safecast began to gather data, we went through, many iterations. And that's the thing about our approach in design in general. It's iterative. We try something. We're basically hackers, you get it out there, even if it's just taped together, and you try it, and then you see how well it works, and then you make changes, you make modifications. And we did that both with the hardware and the visualizations. And over time, understood, well, how can color communicate better? What kind of detail do they need? And one of the main things that we did that no one else had done up to that time, certainly not the governments, was to get a map where you could zoom out and see sort of things color-coded based on the general, averages in those areas, and then zoom in and zoom in and zoom in until you can actually see each individual street corner, and house. And that had not been done. So later, much later, and actually it took, I would say, probably 2 years for the Japanese government to get their own maps that sort of worked similarly. And we won't say that they copied us, but, I think our example was definitely, out there first, and they were aware of that. And by this time, we were getting sort of a steady stream of government people quietly coming to talk to us to, to ask, how did you do what you did? Which is a whole nother story we can touch on. But yeah, to have intuitive visualizations, make it as intuitive as possible. You know, we know Google Maps, that you click on the plus and you zoom in, you click out. And how do you have little things on a sidebar where you can choose, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to look at that, to make it full featured but still easy to use, to make it multilingual. You know, all of these things should be no-brainers. And it took us a while. And again, with this kind of effort, you know, you're not, you know, it takes a while to get things done in a volunteer basis. But ultimately, it became a very full-featured system and a model for many, many others, including lots of government initiatives.
And then I'm showing the examples right now on screen. For example, you have the rows of data of the rice or the fish that was being tested. And people were trying to, I remember looking at these, trying to interpret it. What does it mean? Yeah. What does it mean for my family living in Japan? What does it mean for the world? Yeah, I had no idea how to interpret it. And then you got some designers on the case creating like a pile of rice showing a small speck as opposed to a range of numbers you're supposed to interpret. So much better.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, visual communication is essential, and we know it has to be backed up with data. You know, so we will always say, and this is where the actual data comes from. If you want to see the chart of numbers, here's where that comes from. And these are the, you know, uncertainties about that. And this is, you know, the positive side or the negative side, you know. But yeah, the particular graphics you're talking about is done by a wonderful designer named Andrew Pothecary, who we met. I was asked to write something for the FCCJ, the Foreign Correspondence Club journal, #1 Shimbun, and he was the designer there. And he came up with those. He said, "These are great. Can we continue to use them?" And brilliant visualizations and very, very intuitive. So it makes quite a lot of difference. Compare that to typical government communication, and knowing that the Japanese government has huge budgets for this sort of stuff, and you know, some things have gotten better. But it's often a little bit deceptive or unclear. They're just not good at it. And the reason isn't necessarily because they're bad people or being naturally dishonest. Nobody got the memo, you know. And if it's not specifically, you know, written down on their list of tasks and goals that they have to do this, there's almost no motivation to go the extra mile and make it easier to understand. Or you get, you know, they'll hire designers or something, and often they're big advertising companies, Dentsu or something involved, and they'll get very, very talented designers, but those people don't really know about radiation, and they're not talking to people who are affected, who are telling you what they need to know. And this is a lot of it, that we've had a lot of contact with people and understand their concerns on a one-by-one, and then say, okay, how can we address that very directly? So it's a whole different sense of responsibility, civic mindedness, et cetera, as opposed to, you know, protecting some kind of power structure or political structure or those kinds of, you know, priorities.
Definitely. And I see this in the tourism industry a lot. The creators of information, maps, for example, they're not testing it as an end user. And I think thinking about it by the consumer of the information, how can they take this in as an end user? How can we make it easier for the end user who's not a scientist, who's not an expert, who's not a local, like to be able to see it and interpret it for information that then you can use and feel better or make changes, right?
Yeah, and everything, you know, you have to think of it as sort of something, stages of from simplicity to complexity in terms of information. That sure, you give it initially, this is the overall gist, easily grasped. And if you want to know a little more, well, go here, and this will explain a little more detail. And in case of radiation, you know, it is a bit complex. And then if you're talking about environmental effects from radiation, where does cesium go? Why does it stick to soil, and what does that mean for what happens to the rivers when the soil goes to the rivers, or when that water goes to the ocean. These are very complex systems that are very, very connected, and to try to help people grasp that in an intuitive way is a bit of a challenge. And of course, it's interesting because you mentioned at the very beginning my work with sustainability in Japan, looking at the Edo period, traditional sustainability, and what I really learned from that was that people in the Edo period understood how things were connected, at least in an intuitive way. They weren't scientists, they weren't quantifying everything, but they understood, oh yeah, if I cut these trees over here, well, we might have a flood down there, and that'll ruin those agriculture fields there, and that could have these other, cascading effects. So to understand these things requires a certain kind of insight, and then to communicate them requires some other kind of skills, and I think we've developed that. If anyone wants to sit down and talk, the detailed science, we will sit down with them and talk about it. And then we get, again, lots of researchers, officials and experts to come through who become part of our community and engage us and teach us as well. And we can talk on that level, but then we may have to talk to like high school kids and say, hey, what do you need to know? And in fact, we had developed a set of workshops for elementary and middle school kids, and developed a kind of kit Geiger counter that's reusable. They put it together and they put all the parts on, and then it works, and we can test it. And then we talk about maps, and they can go out and measure. We've been able to teach children about this, to understand the big thing, to answer their big questions. What is this mysterious radiation that's invisible and it must be scary, and then help them to understand, oh, here, in fact, it's everywhere, and then this is probably normal, and this is actually maybe something you would be concerned about, and to help them understand that. So it is possible to communicate this to very, very young humans, as well as to experts. And we are happy that we've developed this kind of very, broad scale approach of connections and engagement.
Wonderful. On screen right now, I'm showing how Safecast is interacting with the scientific community. You've contributed articles to journals, as well as your photo with kids here, teaching them about Geiger counters, doing seminars where you walk around neighborhoods and take readings and collect data on a children's level. We have a great comment from Rising Lotus Wind. Based on what you just explained, Azby, do you think Japan would benefit from a more expanded role for data analysis and data scientists?
Yes. The short answer is yes. What kind of roles? We could talk about that. One thing I want to point out is one of the big problems we saw after Fukushima, and we still see this even like with the coronavirus issues and other issues, is the lack of science journalists. And, there was a time, maybe we're going back more than a decade, where every major outlet and even most, local news outlets had a science journalist on the staff. And these were people who were trained in science and understood that, and their specialty was explaining this stuff to average people. But most of those people have been cut from the payrolls. So there have been very few. So one thing that we ended up finding a need to do was to help scientists understand and get up to speed, or rather journalists get up to speed. And this initially began by talking to people sort of on background. They want to know what's happening with the water at Fukushima. And I would sit, in a coffee shop with journalists from major outlets and talk about this and show them the information we have, and say, I'm not an expert myself, but these are the experts I'm talking to. These people are in the United States. These are in Europe. These are in Japan. You should reach out to them, and they will help you understand this. So we have had a lot of outreach with journalists. And in fact, there's even, a sort of, let's say a field, or there's organizations mainly in Europe specifically to help journalists understand scientific issues, and we've been involved with that as well. So there's a big need for people who can make data understandable to the general public, and we saw a lot of this in the past year with coronavirus. And in fact, that I would say that problem that pandemic has really drawn a lot of attention to the need for good data journalism. And we've seen some absolutely superb examples, seen some not so good ones, but a lot of very good visualizations, about coronavirus, helping to understand, helping to compare infection rates, disease rates, death rates, et cetera. This has been really, really an important thing. So I hope the lesson's getting through, that you need people with a science background who are willing to devote their time to help the general public understand the issues, and to do this in as unbiased a way as possible. And that's the other big issue. Many, almost nothing in our world today, and certainly none of the big problems, whether it's a pandemic or radiation or climate change, none of them are unpoliticized, and all of them lend themselves to biased interpretations and biased presentations. And this is a big problem. So for us, it's an ethical issue that we will, know that it's impossible to totally escape bias or to totally escape any kind of political, context, but we think it is important to try to do that. And we've seen that with the pandemic in a lot of good cases, and we've seen that with many other issues, environmental things as well. And again, I will point to climate change as one that sort of predates the Fukushima disaster and predates coronavirus as well, that we saw a lot of issues. How do you help people understand that? These graphs, et cetera, and you'll have people coming in and saying, no, that's not a hockey puck, a hockey stick, it's something else. So this is a problem, and it's very difficult to get people to remove themselves from their bias.
I'm showing on screen the COVID-19 data and how Safecast is helping to show that data as well. You were talking in, I think it's Japan Times article, you were saying there was a sense of deja vu. Can you explain that?
It was like watching a freight train coming, heading to this other freight train, and you're just standing back and they're going to hit and saying, we've seen this before and we've seen how it works out. And yes, we wrote a couple of articles, one for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was an interesting venue for that. And, the issues regarding information, et cetera, and public communication about coronavirus, they paralleled the radiation risk communication after Fukushima so clearly, and we pointed out that there are very, very well-trained expert communicators who know how to do this. And we've been in training sessions with people like this ourselves. And I mentioned that we have participated in meetings, again, at IAEA or other places, specifically with this community to help understand what they're thinking and how they're preparing and how they communicate, and how do you use social media. For instance, whoever gets their message out fastest wins. The earliest messages are the stickiest. So, you got to get something out there first and say you're on it. How do you balance between the need for getting messages out quickly to say you're looking at it, and not alarming the public, but also not concealing anything? These are very, very difficult things. And we saw that, transparency is always important. It's always the best. And our project at Safecast is primarily about transparency and encouraging government and other institutions to be as transparent as possible. And it's also about, helping people understand. So we saw so many parallels, particularly, and I would just say United States, the President Trump did everything wrong. It was a textbook example of basically taking the every possible guideline for risk communication and doing the absolute wrong thing, and seemingly intentionally. Conflicting messages, contradicting the experts, not letting the experts speak, muzzling them, making everything politicized. It was like really a textbook example. In Japan, things have worked out better, but we still don't really know why. I mean, we know that Japanese people are very cooperative. Once they get the message, they understand there's a need. Okay, yeah, we'll do that. We'll go along with that, even if it's a bit of a pain. And everyone's masking. We're fortunate to have a culture that doesn't, oppose that. People, good hygiene, they're washing their hands, et cetera, and they're cooperating. But that doesn't explain everything. And then the government communication has not been that good. It wasn't good, certainly, for the first 4 or 5 months. I mean, that whole Diamond Princess fiasco, that was just jaw-droppingly idiotic. So, many problems were made. I mean, many mistakes were made in the coronavirus, approaching communication, especially at the beginning, that just repeated what we saw after Fukushima. And again, the biggest one is not providing information or not providing it clearly in a context that people can understand, and not letting the experts who are good at communicating this stuff be out in front doing it. And again, I'll say that there were many good counterexamples, unfortunately not in Japan, not in the United States, and other countries in Europe. Many countries did very, very well. New Zealand, UK had very good public communicators, even though they had a huge risk. So it is a very connected problem. So we said, yeah, this is the same thing going over and over again. And then in Japan, as you recall, the testing problem, was like, well, where do we get tested? And why can't we get tested? And what is the policy? And I wrote about this as well in journals as well as other articles. It took us a long time to figure out what the testing policy was for coronavirus. In fact, that it was an intentional policy not to test many people because of the fear of overwhelming the healthcare system with patients who needed to be hospitalized. So this was, not made clear from the beginning. And had it been, then maybe it would have been better and there would have been less panic. I mean, there was a lot of panic back last spring and summer. Also surrounding these emergency declarations, what are the real rules and what are we supposed to do and who's involved? And even this new one that was just announced a few days ago. Well, what are the restrictions? Are there any restrictions? And again, Japan, as you know, a big difference from a lot of countries is that legally the government is not allowed to force people to comply. You can't put legal, penalties on most of this, and that's a good thing. And that comes because of the terrible history, pre-war and wartime years about coercion of the public to do various things. So that's a positive thing in general, and we're good that Japanese are compliant. But then you need stronger guidance, and it needs to be clear. And I hate to say it, government here is just not good at communication.
You gave an example talking about testing a little bit. About there is no national cancer registry in Japan, and
Yes.
you gave the example of thyroid cases for cancer in Korea.
Of thyroid cases in Korea? Well, this is a big, interesting issue and a problem. Yes. So after the disaster in Fukushima, of course, there's a big concern about the potential for people to contract cancer because of radiation exposure, because we know radiation can be a carcinogen. And we know this happened. And after Chernobyl, there was a huge outbreak of thyroid cancer in children, or people who were children at the time of their exposure. And so that is a huge risk. And it's a very complex issue for a lot of reasons because, these things it's what we call a stochastic risk. In other words, it is an increased probability of contracting the cancer. Radiation exposure, there's one kind of health problem that can arrive from very, very large doses, being incurred that actually kill cells immediately. And if you saw the Chernobyl TV series on HBO, that they showed these people really in very, very having organ failure and bleeding from their orifices and things. And this is acute radiation syndrome, which comes from very, 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 very high doses, like really close to reactor or really in that kind of situation. For the kinds of doses that most people got in the Chernobyl area or in the Fukushima area, it's a question of, well, is this enough to cause a certain percentage likelihood increase of the cancer or not? And this is true for the thyroid cancer as well. So the Japanese government instituted a ultrasound testing program for 300,000 people who were children between the ages of 0 and 18 at the time of the disaster of their exposure, and had been monitoring them. And there were a lot of thyroid cancer cases uncovered during this screening process. Now, what does that mean? I was fortunate to be introduced to leading thyroid cancer experts, including the people who were the ones who determined at Chernobyl that those children's thyroid cancer was from the radiation exposure. Because what happened after Chernobyl was WHO and other organizations said, we're not going to see any cancer. We don't expect any health problems from this. And they said that fairly quickly. But the disaster in Chernobyl was 1986. By 1990, 1991, they were getting reports. People at certain agencies were getting reports of thyroid disease in the Chernobyl area. And basically, a researcher at WHO named Keith Baverstock was told by his bosses they could not go investigate. There's no need to investigate. It must be bad data. Those, Russians, So he put together a separate team that included both, researchers from the Soviet Union, and what later became, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and also from the UK, a guy named Dylan Williams, and they went and they investigated, and they said, this is definitely radiation. And they were beaten up in the press and in these institutes, said, it can't be possible, it's impossible, it's impossible, it's impossible, but they demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt. So, and ultimately that led to the protective principles for radiation disasters to prioritize protecting children against radiation thyroid exposure. Well, what happened after Fukushima was they did not get enough testing immediately of people's to measure directly on the thyroid to say how much radiation exposure they got. There was only 1,500 or so people tested, not enough, and there was a lot of reasons for that. But basically, the government did not push for it to happen, and then they were not given potassium iodide, which is what's given to people to prevent their thyroids from taking up iodine, including radioactive iodine, after an accident like this. That was not given out in most cases. Only one town distributed that. So there's a lot of questions. Then they start the screening, and sure enough, boom, 100 kids had thyroid cancer. Very, very soon after. And of course, this was very alarming. But what Dylan Williams and others had explained to me as far back as 2012 was, when you do a mass screening of a lot of people, you're going to find a lot of cases that you would not have found otherwise, because usually people go to the doctor to get tested when they're already having symptoms. There's some problem, then they go. Most of our understanding of the normal incidence, the normal rate of these things, is from that kind of data. And it's hard to compare Fukushima to Chernobyl because many reasons. The doses in Chernobyl were much higher. Really 10, 100 times higher, even the average. And the children had an iodine deficiency in the diet, which they didn't have in Japan. Plus evacuations were done fairly quickly, which may have helped. They said it's hard to compare, but you were going to see these, and this will likely be what we call a screening effect. So back to Korea. There's a lot of people who refuse to believe that, and good for people to push back, because I would say that the screening program established by the Japanese government after Fukushima was not done transparently enough. And it included people involved in running it who had lost public trust, and they were involved in key positions. So those were not good. But they got the program up and running and were gathering the data. The government was never explaining, for instance, that in order to identify if whether or not there is a kind of an outbreak of something like thyroid cancer, you need to have at least 3 rounds of testing. The first round will give you a baseline, what's called the baseline prevalence of that. So it's as if I was going to a school and checking kids for asthma and seeing how many kids out of this 100 have asthma. Okay, there's 6 kids with asthma. And then the next year going and check again, saying how many kids have it now? Are there more or less? Well, this year there's 8. So you have a comparison. That gives you what's called an incidence. Then you go one more time and say, okay, here's a year later, we measure again, how many kids have it now? Well, now it's the same number as before, so the incidence is not increasing. It takes 3 steps. The government did not explain that to people. So they're going, oh my God, 100 thyroid cancers. Okay. And then they're not trusting the government. Government lost trust immediately after the disaster. So basically what happened in Korea, and this is the example, finally getting around to that, is the Korean government a decade or so ago decided to allow people to have thyroid sonogram tests as part of their normal health checkup. And immediately there was a huge, what appeared to be an epidemic of thyroid cancer. And this has been written up in medical journals and in books as a textbook case of overdiagnosis. In other words, had they not, if you're comparing that to before, of course it's going to look like a lot of cases because you weren't checking for that before. If you check everybody, it's going to look like a lot. And what people, the specialists, the epidemiologists are looking at is, well, is the death rate increasing, the mortality rate? And they're looking and saying, no, we're not seeing any change in the mortality rate. It means that these are thyroid diseases that are being discovered that were basically benign or not leading to these kinds of major problems. Now, again, it's a very complex issue because in Fukushima, the cases were, many of them, most of them were actually real cancers. They weren't, fake cancers. Maybe they were aggressive. Maybe there would be a lot that would be benign. But as Dr. Williams pointed out to me, when they do autopsies of people, in elderly people, almost everybody has thyroid tumors. Almost everybody. That enough people have tumors in their thyroid that maybe they should stop calling them cancer because it may be a different thing. So it's a very complex issue, and it's still going on here because this testing program is still going on. We have not seen this huge uptick, but also at the same time, the participation rate in this, screening programs is declining. It's going to be hard to know. But we're coming up to 10 years, and that is a good place to take stock of whether or not we're seeing any kind of thyroid cancer epidemic. But compared to what happened in Chernobyl 10 years later, it was clear. It was going off the charts. It was basically almost, a very big upward curve on that, and we're not seeing that here. So
I thought that was this example, although it's Korea, that everybody was being tested because it was included in the insurance, but then they stopped testing so much. And so this is a typical case of how it might be related to the testing instead of the actual disease or what they're trying to test for. And I think, a lot of people are questioning in terms of COVID testing. There's a real lack of data.
There's uncertainties. The testing isn't, of course, there's not enough testing to begin with in Japan, for instance, or maybe there's some way to argue that maybe it is sufficient in some basic way, but there are inherent uncertainties as well. You may come up negative, but you actually are positive, or you may come up positive, but actually that was a false positive, and other issues like that. But again, I just want to point out back to the issue of thyroid cancer in Fukushima. It's good to have people pushing back on this, to be really, interrogating the data and saying maybe they've missed something. Maybe this is not transparent enough. Maybe this data is not complete enough. What about these other cases, et cetera? It's important to have that for transparency and as a reality check. But I think, and may get criticism for that, I think, fortunately, we're not seeing a big outbreak of thyroid cancer from Fukushima. It doesn't mean there's none. And the same thing for other cancers. There will undoubtedly be some. I mean, this is a stochastic, it's a probabilistic thing. There will undoubtedly be some cases, but how many and will they be able to be detected by our epidemiology? Knowing that epidemiology itself is sort of a blunt tool. It's working again with probabilities and kind of very distanced from the actual data and experience. So for coronavirus,
and even for Fukushima radiation as well. One of the questions in the talk was, can I trust the data? What does the data mean? Can I access my data? Is the thyroid disease in Fukushima radiation related? These are all very typical questions.
These are coming in?
No, from one of your presentations. And then the Safecast response is, if we can learn how to establish social standards of truth around environmental measurement, we can do it in other spheres as well.
Was it truth or trust?
Truth. It says truth.
Okay. I would say both. We focus a lot on trust. But yeah, what is valid? How do you establish something as accepted as valid? And again, for us, like our system, when we first started, the expert community was very skeptical and sometimes outrightly hostile. and saying this is, this are amateurs, and what are they using? Could be junk, it's not calibrated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we were invited to go talk to the IAEA in February of 2014, and that changed everything. We basically, explained the system, explained that we were open to their input, but we stressed that for us, the way to establish a trustworthy system is to make it as open as possible, as transparent as possible, that anybody could look at our stuff, see how it works, and that they want to propose changes or point out problems, they're welcome to do that, and that will improve the whole thing. So this is an open source project. And little by little, we found more and more experts who were interested in the project and wanted to participate and wanted to help. So that's been a very, very good thing. The problem is, truth is elusive. And even scientific truth is elusive. It always is contextualized. And I mentioned these problems of bias. For us, we want to say you can always go and look at the raw numbers, the raw data, and see what the numbers are, what the data is, and see how the system works and what its strengths and weaknesses are, what it's going to tell you very clearly, what it's not going to tell you, to see how the data is processed, to see how it's visualized. We just make all of that open. We just lay all that bare, willing to, encounter criticism or other, reactions to that. And for us, it's the important thing. And very, very few systems, even government systems, have that degree of transparency. It relies on the sort of expert model. And again, you trust the trained experts who are, certified. They have degrees, PhDs. They're in these, organizations with very, very clearly stipulated guidelines, et cetera. But we point out that after Fukushima, basically, they failed. They really failed. And people were not getting the information they needed, the information that the expert community and the government agencies thought people needed was not really what people wanted to know. They could not anticipate that people in Tokyo would be very, very concerned about radiation exposure because, the big issue is Fukushima. But in fact, people saw radiation levels rise in Tokyo at the time. So, people very concerned. People in other parts of the world, people in Japan, the experts and the government people I talked to were absolutely astounded when they heard that people in California were concerned about radiation from Fukushima. People were like avoiding going into the swimming pools because they were concerned, and how could that be? You have to understand human nature and the nature of concern, the nature of fear, and how do you help people understand that kind of thing? So these are very, very big issues. So yeah, truth is very elusive. And, we talk a lot more about trust because to some degree that's something easier to grasp than something as, say, philosophical or, as rooted in, I would say, epistemology. I mean, I don't want to get too, pointy-headed about it, but big problem now, and we're seeing this, again, with coronavirus, we see it with climate change, we see it in the political sphere. Not only are people not sharing, agreeing on what is truth, what are the facts, what is the data, we're not even agreeing now how to determine what is truth, what are the facts. This is a huge issue, and this is a major rift that's developed in our society over the past decades. Each side, each team wants to have its own truth. And for us, this is a huge crisis, and we're hoping to address it at least in the areas that we're working in by making somehow a trustworthy system and to develop models for trust. And if I can just continue on this, one of our insights has been that it's important to make a system where the system itself can be trusted, even if individuals involved in participating in it don't even know or trust each other. And there may be parallels in some things, blockchain has emerged, for instance, recently, as one example of that. But yes, how do you make a system that's trustworthy, even if the people don't trust each other? And the transparency of the system is the huge part of it.
I mean, that's a very important argument, I think, is rubbish in, rubbish out, right? If you've got bad data coming in, you're going to have bad results, is an argument people would often have. But without the open source data, you're lacking in any kind of interpretation, any kind of result, or just limiting it to the only specified small group of people who have access. So the public service that you're doing is really important that it continues. But you're right, it needs to be done in a responsible way by responsible people. And that conversation needs to be had, right?
Absolutely. And we're just trying to set an example, to set a very high bar for transparency and trustworthiness through this approach. And we see, again, more and more receptivity in the expert community and elsewhere, certainly within society. But, it's a very long process to actually see the important changes that need to be made to actually see them happen. And, we're 10 years in, and actually we're preparing for our 10th anniversary. I wanted to mention that earlier, but we will be having a 10th anniversary event in March 14th, 13th, 14th, which we will do as a kind of a mobile live stream, traveling through Fukushima and having people joining us from other parts of the world over the course of a day, and to really sort of take stock of the situation and where we are. And we'll include lots of different voices in that. So this is a big thing. 10 years is a long time. I'm kind of surprised we're still involved. I'm still engaged, but it's become a big part of my life and the life of my colleagues at Safecast as well. But yeah, we just really want to set an example for how we think things should be done.
And I think the community engagement part through workshops and events is really important part of what you guys do. Joe Maras has a comment. Safecast workshops are a two-way tool. Participants get to learn about the facts, but we Safecast get valuable feedback on what communication really works.
Yes. And of course, over time, we learned how to do this. And yeah, knowing firsthand the concerns of the community is also a big part of that. And as I mentioned, this has been one of the reasons that a lot of official government efforts and others have not been successful, because they sort of come with these prior assumptions of what's necessary. But really, getting people on the ground to be involved and to let you know what they're thinking is very, very important.
We have about 5 more minutes. Do you want to talk a little bit about how people might get involved if they're interested? How could you become a volunteer for Safecast?
It's very easy. And again, there's lots of ways to contribute. Most of our volunteers are people out in the world gathering data, collecting data. And that means getting a hold of a BGIG kit. And we are constantly developing new hardware and new systems that do this stuff. There's lots of communities that already have these. So anybody can get this and gather data and upload it. It can be done anonymously. Lots of ways to do that. We always have a need for people who are, for instance, doing coding, people who are communicators, people who can write, people who there's so many things. I'm looking at our Slack channel. Our Slack has about 20 channels of different projects, from data moderation to organizing events to fabrication issues to sort of the big thinking side. We have a lot of activity in the United States regarding air quality, because we developed a line of air quality sensors, which before the coronavirus thing happened, were beginning to be deployed at the public libraries in the Los Angeles County area. So we have these ventures as well. You go to safecast.org and you can see there's places there where you can click to find out about participating, about helping. Again, you can email info@safecast.org, and one of us will respond to that as well. We publicize our events. If you want to have a workshop, or you're a teacher or something like that, you can get in touch with us. And anyone, maybe they want to go through you to get in touch with me directly, that's certainly open to that. But we're happy to entertain all of these things and open. We usually have big events, big public events, at the beginning of the year, a big Shinenkai, which we didn't do this year. And then in March, our event will probably be primarily online. So we're not able to do these public gatherings, which are always really important for people getting to know each other and sort of getting to know what kind of people we are and seeing if they want to join up with us. But this time we'll be doing it virtually, and we hope that people will tune in to those events as well.
Yeah, I'm showing a little bit from the website, but definitely have a look at the website if you're
Yeah.
interested. Also about the SDG goals. Um,
Yes. Yep.
there's a lot of SDG
Hmm.
goals related, like and what you've
Very
written
much.
about in your book.
Yeah.
These are not isolated problems in our
Right.
society, environment, and earth and people are
Hmm.
so interrelated, interconnected. And it's
Yeah.
not only individuals, you also have the post office who's helping
Hmm.
to retrieve data and send it
Right.
to the system.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lots of, and again, institutions and schools and lots of organizations are also recognizing the need or the usefulness of this stuff, and so we're welcoming that kind of activity as well. Yeah, there's lots of problems that we are sharing, and many of them are similar to some degree. That they may be global. They may involve environment. They may involve, for instance, human rights regarding the environment. They may involve governance. They may be heavily influenced by technology, whether it's media, social media, or technological developments for sensors, et cetera. What do people know? How do they know it? What about the privacy issues? These are all very, very connected. Radiation in food. If you're an organic farmer in Fukushima, you had a very hard time after 2011. And interestingly, it was the organic farmers who did some of the most thorough and strictest radiation monitoring of their food. So these are all very, very connected, and we're very connected communities around the world, and we want to make it possible for people to contribute.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Azby. It was wonderful hearing all about Safecast and getting an idea of what kind of work you guys are doing with the community. And thank you so much for everything you guys are doing.
Well, thank you for having me and for being interested in Safecast and helping us, share our experiences like this. And we're totally open to talking more about it and engaging with anybody who wants to talk to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll have you on again, Azby, and talking more about the Edo period, Japanese architecture, and sustainability. We'll talk about your books that you've written as well next time. Thank you so
Uh,
much.
I really look forward to that. Thank you.
That's great. So this is our last sustainability talk this week. We have more great talks next week. So have a great weekend, everyone. Take care. Thank you for joining. Bye.